Thanks, Carol. I might invite the panellists up to the stage, as we might introduce them as we go. And I think we're keen to have a robust but informal discussion today. Just while they're coming up, I might make a couple of opening remarks. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're gathered and pay my respects. And thank the Rotary Club of Melbourne for pulling this panel together today. It's a fantastic panel on a really interesting topic. Had I known you were accepting honorary members of interesting heritage, I may have thought twice about accepting moderation, but the Risley nose lives strong, so I'm glad that you now have an honorary member in your club. Just to start, I thought I'd provide a little bit of context. So I'm sure we all understand the reasons to combat climate change, but today we were keen to also talk about the circular economy. At the moment, we're witnessing what could be described as one of the most radical transitions of the modern industrial age. And sustainability, climate and the circular economy are at the forefront of this. So if you haven't heard of the term circular economy, I thought I'd just very quickly give you a description of what it is. So in our current economy, materials are taken from the earth, products are made, we use them and we throw them away. So that process is linear. A circular economy effectively decouples economic activity from the consumption of finite resources. And to achieve a circular economy, it's absolutely critical to us achieving our Paris targets to keep global warming within a 1.5 degree range. So why is this important? So the way we're using resources at the moment, put simply, isn't sustainable. Global resource use has more than tripled since 1970. Global material demand per capita has increased from 7.4 tonnes in 1970 to 12.2 tonnes in 2017. And I thought, just to depress you a little bit more, I'd just have another couple of sobering facts. It's not just our use of resources per capita which is significant. Australians are some of the worst offenders per capita when it comes to the generation of waste, and there's a huge opportunity to improve here. So, for example, in Victoria, only 43% of food waste is recovered. And a really significant study of food, hospitality and retail outlets in Victoria found that only 3% of food was recovered and 97% of food went directly to landfill. So I know the Sofitel is an absolute leader in this space, so that's not the case here, but there is huge opportunity for us to improve. And the forecast for our oceans is also a bit bleak. In 2014, there was a 1:5 ratio for plastic to fish in the oceans, and by 2050, it's forecast to be a 1:1 ratio. There will be as much plastic in the ocean as there is fish. So we've got a bit to do on the environment and sustainability front. And so today here with an esteemed panel to discuss the impacts, the opportunities for leadership with the environment and the circular economy. I'll introduce them now one at a time and invite them to make a couple of opening remarks as well. So Usha, we might start with you. Usha Ayaranga is a professor at the School of Property, Construction and Project Management at RMIT University. She is a widely acclaimed expert in sustainability and the circular economy. She's someone that I have on speed dial when I have a tricky question that I need to answer. She's widely recognised for her leadership and is co-leader of the Sustainable Buildings and Construction Program at the UN's One Planet Network. Usha, I invite you to say a couple of words.
Thank you, Jill. So Jill gave you some facts and figures around where we are at today. I would just want to add one more thing to that, and that is that if everyone lived like the Australians did, we need about 5.5 planets to survive. That's our footprint on the planet. And we know that we've only got one planet to survive on, so it's really, really important that we look after this planet. When people talk about the circular economy, a lot of people get a little bit confused, and I would like to explain what the circular economy actually means. There are three principles that underpin the circular economy. The first one is about pollution and not creating any waste. So while the circular economy talks about waste management, it is not waste management. It is much more than waste management. It's about rethinking how we use products, materials, how we design things so that we don't end up getting waste. So the idea of a circular economy is to actually eliminate waste in the system. So we don't want to use the word waste. The circular economy is also about ensuring that products and materials are used over and over and over again. So when we have a phone or your laptop or cars, anything that we use on a day-to-day basis, we want to try and make sure that cars are used for the production of cars. When you buy a phone, you don't throw the phone away every 3 or 4 years, but you try and retain the phone and change parts of the phone that don't work for us anymore. And a good example of that is what the Japanese did with the Olympics, and they tried and recovered as many materials as they could from phones and other electronic devices, and they made metals out of it. The third important aspect of the circular economy is recognizing that we only have one planet. So we need to allow the Earth to regenerate. So over the last 200 years, all the things that we have done in terms of our production and consumption processes has been very much about a linear economy, thinking that we can continue to mine into the future, don't really think about the impact that the mining is having. So a really good example of a circular economy in the future would be where we don't need to mine virgin resources anymore. And whatever we have within the system, as much as possible, is retained and used and reused over and over again. So recycling is very much a small part of this equation of the circular economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Usha. Our next panellist will be known to everyone here, I'm sure, and it's our Lord Mayor of the City of Melbourne, Sally Capp. Sally is, as we all know, a tireless advocate for Melbourne and an extraordinarily hardworking Lord Mayor. She does so much to ensure that we remain one of the world's great cities, including your support of the 2023 Rotary International Convention, and I've heard the story many times of your efforts to ensure that we were the host city. She's also a vocal champion for multiple sustainability initiatives to ensure that Melbourne also remains one of Australia's most sustainable cities. So thank you, Lord Mayor, for being on the panel, and invite you to make some comments.
Thank you, Jill, and thank you to Adrian and everybody at Rotary for inviting me back. I'm here with members of our wonderful team from the City of Melbourne who are doing a lot of this work day in, day out, so it's lovely to have all of them here too. I think one of the great understatements of the day is yours, Jill, when you said, after all those incredible and very disturbing facts, we've got a bit to do. We have got so much to do. But the great news is, and just listening to Usha, that many of those things are within our control. They're within our intellect. They're within our efforts and our resources to make a massive difference. And I really wanted to acknowledge Ian Risley in putting this on the agenda for an organisation like Rotary that literally exists in communities around the world and is able to influence and I think more directly manage these issues. So congratulations, it's so important. Just a couple of things from me, because we are an organisation dedicated to really big goals that have global impacts, like being a city 100%, using 100% renewable energy by 2030 and zero net emissions by 2040. That's our big targets that we know will have global impact, but the way that we achieve that is definitely local. At the City of Melbourne, we've reduced our emissions by 76%, and we're working now on the last 24, but we know that we need to be supporting, leading, standing beside, pushing from behind all of the organisations and individuals across our municipality, because it's only together that we're really going to achieve those goals. So I think that sense of working together, sharing knowledge, but also pushing and pulling each other is important. When I was here last year, we were talking about food waste, and I mentioned that through our FOGO trial we had 23,000 households that had adopted food recycling, food and garden recycling, and that as a result of that, at that point we'd diverted 1,200 tonnes of waste away from landfill, which was quite extraordinary. I can tell you today that we've just started our trials in high-rise, which is the big conundrum that is really difficult to solve, and we've added another 2,000 households through the trial, so up to 25,000 households, and we've now diverted, though, 2,400 tonnes of waste away from landfill. So people are becoming more proactive, and I'm sure you're seeing that in your households. And I mention that because wasn't lunch delicious? To Clive and Adam, thank you. And perhaps to Usha's point, when we think about the food that does go into our FOGO bin, we could probably ask ourselves, probably couldn't create something as lovely as that dish at lunchtime, but what else could we be doing with that food? So that's just an update on FOGO. A couple of other things that we're doing around the circular economy in the city. We've now got e-bikes going around the city collecting coffee grinds and food waste from small businesses, food being an enormous amount of the waste generated in our city, and bringing it back to our dehydrator that creates compost for our parks and gardens. So that's happening across the city. We do an enormous amount with water management and recycling of water, whether it's rainwater capture or it's grey water, and I think there's a lot we can do more there. We also are using recycled glass for our protected bicycle lanes. I love to be controversial at these lunches. I've said bicycle lanes. And we're using recycled material. And I also thought I'd mention a new product that we're using on our roads for paving called Green Pave You, which is a composite of a number of recycled products as a way, instead of using more asphalt, actually reusing existing materials. So that gives you some examples of what we're doing, but we know across just our own procurement spend that there's a lot more that we could be doing.
Thank you, Lord Mayor. We're also fortunate to have Bob on our panel, and Bob will be known to many of you as well as a past president of the Rotary Club of Melbourne. Bob is a volunteer leader at Donations in Kind, which we just saw an amazing video about on the screen. Donations in Kind recycles equipment and supplies and sends it to 33 countries around the world. So Bob, I'll hand over to you to make a couple of remarks.
Thanks, Jill. I was very pleased when past Rotary International President Ian spoke about Rotary's acceptance or decision to accept as a seventh area of focus the environmental and sustainability. Donations in Kind had been involved in just that same process since 1978. But we didn't call it a circular economy then, it was just called stopping it going to waste. And I think it's grown enormously in that period of time. You saw some of those shots on the screen of the warehouse at West Footscray, and you think that in that 5,000 square metres of racked storage, everything in that store previously would have gone into landfill. Some of it might have been recycled, but most of it would have ended up in landfill because people were too lazy to think what else they could do with it rather than just toss it in the rubbish bin. We've found over the last little period of time a much greater knowledge, recognition, interest in what happens at donations in kind, as an example, because people are more conscious of it. We know the people that we're dealing with want to talk to us more about what they can do with the stuff that they can no longer use. They don't want to send it to the tip because it costs them too much money. So how can we utilise it, save money, at the same time put it back into the business somewhere? And most of our stuff goes back into the business overseas. It's not happening in Australia so much from our perspective of donations in kind, but certainly majority of it will end up in a country overseas, the Pacific Islands, the African countries and the like. Whilst I'm not involved with it specifically, there are 3 other Rotary projects that are very much into the circular economy, and they handle all of the domestic furniture. I mean, Melbourne is a strange place. If you've got something to get rid of, you stick it on your footpath and somebody will take it away. It doesn't happen in many other cities, but it happens here in Melbourne. And people have a lot of fun going around looking at other people's nature strips and seeing what they can find. But the fact of the matter is now there are 3 big Rotary programs that are stopping a lot of stuff ending up on nature strips and finding their way into people's own homes where they're needed, particularly after things like bushfires and floods and the like, where the Western Emergency, Eastern Emergency and Inner Melbourne Emergency Relief Networks organisation are recycling an immense amount of, sorry, I shouldn't say recycling, should I? I should say repurposing an immense amount of domestic furniture that would otherwise be stuck on a nature strip and probably end up in the tip.
Thanks, Bob. And I've been reliably informed that the adjective is someone, or it's a verb, who takes things from the side of the road is called wombling, and I assume it's named after the Wombles back in the 70s. And Ruben, last but not least, we're really fortunate to have Ruben Berg on our panel. Ruben is a proud Gunditjmara man from Melbourne, and Gunditjmara territory is down near Warrnambool, beautiful country I believe, and he's a member of the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria. Ruben uses his skills, his enthusiasm and his passion to share his Aboriginal culture and heritage, and it's wonderful to have you here. I'll let you say a few words.
Thank you. Nyata, Nyatuk Gunditjmara, Nyatu Nyatlinyong Ruben Berg. As was said, my name's Ruben Berg. I'm a proud Gunditjmara man, and it's a real pleasure to be able to be here today with you on the lands of the Wurundjeri peoples. I've had the good fortune of being able to work in this space around considering this concept of sustainability for quite some time in the work that I've done, both with the work that we're trying to progress through treaty here as the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria, and thinking about how there are decisions being made about our lands and our waters that are probably best made by First Peoples themselves, so trying to progress those conversations. But also in the work that I'd done previously as a Commissioner for the Victorian Environmental Water Holder, and seeing what was happening with our water within our environment and how much we had neglected our rivers and our waterways for so long, and how we've finally realised that they're valuable things, not just for moving things up and down along. And when I reflect on those things from an Indigenous perspective, I always find it kind of intriguing when there's this conversation around a sense of a discovery about sustainability and a circular economy, when really it should be seen as a rediscovery, because we've been doing these things as First Peoples for tens of thousands of years here on these lands. And one of the most powerful examples of that always comes to my mind is something that's actually quite close to where we are here today. If you were to walk across the road over that way for about 200 metres or so, maybe 500, you'd come to one of the many scarred trees that we have here around Victoria. And a scarred tree is where bark has been purposely removed from a tree to make something. It could be used to make a canoe, it could be used to make a shield or a shelter. There's lots of different purposes for removing that bark. And if you think about it, if you wanted a canoe, one of your choices is you just go ahead and chop down a tree and make a canoe. Then you'd have a canoe, but there's no more tree. Well, our ancestors, a long, long time ago, worked out we don't need the whole tree to be chopped down. We can just take off these single sheets of bark to make our canoe, and the tree will still get to live. So to me, those are powerful reminders that sustainability isn't some newfangled idea. It's something that has been practiced, and I think it is really important to be able to acknowledge and respect that.
So we might just pick up on that. Indigenous Australians obviously have an ancient connection to the land. from an Indigenous perspective, what are you seeing with the state of the environment at the moment?
Yeah, I think obviously we've heard all the stats and figures as well. We're not in the best position that we could be, and I think there is a lot of things that we can continue to draw and learn from in terms of Indigenous knowledge of how things have operated across the thousands of years. There is some really positive change that is happening in that space. So when we look at fire management within this nation, there is a much greater understanding now that the traditional practices of managing the land through fire were very effective in suiting the environment here, and that we're bringing back and reintroducing those things, which is really quite powerful, as I said. But also around water, recognising that we can no longer just be using our rivers as just a transportation service. And when we look at places like up at the Murray River, oftentimes the river is essentially just seen as a highway to move water from one place down to the other place to get to the farms. And we can be doing a much better job of that. So I think if we had continued on the path we had been going on as a society prior to the last 20, 30 years, we would be in dire strife. We're still in significant strife, but I think it's slowly the society as a whole is coming around to recognising and viewing things from an Indigenous perspective, which I do have the hope that will lead to some much better outcomes that we can see soon.
Thanks, Ruben. As we mentioned before, we are seeing a really radical transition at the moment around energy and the circular economy. Usha and Lord Mayor, how are you seeing this come to life within your organisations?
So from an educational perspective, obviously, and I see some school students around here, which is great, we need to start thinking about the next generation of students and what we teach the next generation of students. We certainly don't want them to continue in this perilous journey of linear economy that we have been on. So I think that's really, really critical. They're going to be the decision makers of tomorrow. They're going to inherit what we leave behind tomorrow. So it's really important that they learn how to navigate their way and make the decisions that are the right decisions for the planet, but also for the people. So that's really important. The second point, I think, is, Australia with a population of 26 million, and you look at the rest of the world, and particularly where Australia is placed geographically across Asia. And so we're doing a lot of work across the Pacific Islands, of course, but we're also doing a lot of work with countries like India and China. And just imagine, 1.3 billion people, if they start adopting lifestyles that we have. So if every Indian and every Chinese and every Indonesian started adopting Australian type of lifestyles, it's just not going to be possible to have a planet that can support us all in the future. So it's really important to start thinking about those design decisions that we make today and how those decisions impact the future. So really need that long-term thinking, but just not in the context of our production and consumption practices, but also a big unknown in terms of climate change. And particularly in the built environment, the design decisions that are made today are locked in for 50, 80, 100 years. So really, really important for us to start thinking about, if you're building that bridge, does that bridge need to be a few meters higher than what would normally have been? Because we are not having 1 in 500-year floods anymore. It's more like 10 years or 20 years, 50 years. So, really start thinking about the impact of the decisions that we're going to have today and how that's going to be in the next 30, 40, 50 years.
I'll just pick up on the theme at a more granular level perhaps, and that's really to encourage everybody around behaviour change. At the end of the day, we are developing all sorts of new technologies. One of our programs at the moment around energy, for example, is called Power Melbourne. It's going to be an independent network of community-scale batteries about the size of shipping containers around the city to be able to disrupt and help that transition to renewable energy across the grid, but really to provide direct access to renewable energy for individual households and small businesses. 80% of our residents live in high-rise and can't have their own solar panels. And this project really came about because we want to encourage and support new technology development around batteries, for example. But really the motivation was that many of our residents in those high rises that couldn't directly access renewable energy said, we want to be able to, you're going to have to help us, and that has led to a big new project across our city. I think when we're talking about the circular economy, many of the decisions that are absolutely imperative to getting scale in circular economy, to really driving procurement decisions that can support the circular economy, come down to human behaviours and decisions. We've got all sorts of policies at Town Hall about what we're supposed to do when we're making decisions and buying something, but so often those imperatives around circular economy get overlooked because a price is better or some other feature stands out, and I think we've really got to be more conscious and deliberate about our own behaviour change and also encouraging behaviour change in those around us.
Thanks, Lord Mayor. The Lord Mayor mentioned earlier around individuals taking accountability and responsibility, and so I just wanted to ask, I guess, Bob and Ruben, are you seeing a change in people's perceptions and people's behaviours at a grassroots level?
The short answer is yes, Jill. A lot of the goods that we get in donations in kind comes from public hospitals, public schools, as well as private hospitals and private schools. All of the medical equipment, school desks and chairs, where previously they were not conscious of finding another home for them, it's very, very obvious now that people are thinking more about finding somebody who can utilise something that they don't want. I notice it particularly with the hospitals with hospital beds. I mean, they're big, cumbersome things. Previously, they would go to the tip, sometimes to the metal recycler, but mainly the tip, because that was the easiest way to do it. Now we get more conversations with the supply people in the hospitals saying, we've got this program to change hospital beds. We're going to do 100 over the course of the next X months. Can you take them all? Whereas previously that sort of conversation never took place. It was usually, we've had 100 beds changed, can you come and pick them up tomorrow? The answer was no, and because you can't do that, that's when they end up to the tip. So the change, I think, is very marked, particularly in those two government areas, education and hospitals, both within the government system and within the private system, that people are far more conscious of putting it to better use.
Yeah, I think absolutely we are seeing some of those changes in trends of how people are doing things on an individual level, and oftentimes the conversation I try and spark with people around that too is to see these sorts of sustainable practices at an individual level as essentially an act of reconciliation, of being able to connect with and respect First Nations peoples and their traditions by undertaking those sorts of sustainable initiatives. And I think it is really important at that individual level, and I think it's also important at the top level, the governance level. But I think oftentimes it's just as important that kind of middle level, that community level, that we can be empowering communities to have the information they need to make decisions that are going to work for them, so that at a more local level we can get some really powerful outcomes there. And that's not just about sustainability to me, that's across the board, and that's what we're trying to progress with treaties, to making sure that there is that decision making at the right levels, because across the board I think you see the best outcomes when people are empowered to have a say on the things that directly affect them, and working together as smaller communities we often get better results than just on our own or just with what is coming from over the top too.
Thanks, Ruben. And just because the Lord Mayor mentioned bike lanes, I figured we're up for a bit of controversy. One of the ways to get people to do stuff is just to legislate it. Let's just pull a hard lever. And we're seeing that around the world with places like France. So France has the most significant and far-reaching laws around the circular economy and waste and recycling. So to give you a couple of examples, they have banned the destruction of unsold non-food products. You can't send products to landfill because they're unsold. The introduction of mandatory repairability index on electronic products and mandated drinking fountains in all buildings which are open to the public, just to name a couple. I'll just open it to the panel for whoever wants to pick it up. Should we be introducing new laws, or should we continue to rely on the coalition of the willing?
I'm happy to crack at it first. My short answer to the question, should we have more legislation, is no, because necessarily legislation doesn't solve the problem. We've got lots of legislation now. I mean, it's illegal to take drugs. There are some road rules, but we still kill people. They're all pieces of legislation that people avoid or people ignore. So we've got to be very careful in just putting blank legislation in. To me, the process is more education rather than legislation. And it's a question of where does that education start? Ruben made a good point. We need to know more about what has happened in the past and how that can be utilised far better. And we start with the kids in school. There's no doubt about that. They understand what is right and what is wrong relative to this particular question. I'm sure that as they grow, they'll influence their parents. We hear that often enough now about the influence that kids will have on their parents. I think that's a better option than pure legislation, Jill.
Well, it's going to be both. It's a very technical term in government land, carrots and sticks. And you try carrots for as long as you can, but you do need to have some sticks ready to go. We don't want to do that, but it comes down to behaviour change, and it really is a mix around decision making and whatever encouragement that takes, whether it's carrots or sticks. And I'll give you some examples. At the moment, we've got a project on the go around decarbonising existing commercial buildings in the city. Cities contribute 75% of the emissions around the world, so we really need to address what's happening in cities. Within the City of Melbourne, 66% of our emissions come from existing commercial buildings and the way that they are powered and the way that we use them. So this project has a lot of carrots in there, ways in which levels of government can assist building owners and tenants to move from gas to electricity, for example, change window treatments, look at other ways in which they're using their buildings. But another part of the policy suite that we are considering is actually differential rates. So if you don't convert your building, you will be paying higher rates, and that is to compensate the community for the cost of the gas and the impact on the environment. So that mixture of carrots and sticks is important.
I just add to all that I think if there is going to be some sort of legislation around these sorts of things, I would really hope that there was maybe some form of voice so that Aboriginal people could have a say in that legislation too.
Beautifully said. I'll give you the last word, Usha.
Thanks, Jill. I just wanted to say that I think everything has its place, so I agree with what has already been said. But I think also sometimes, though, that the legislation brings everyone to the same level playing field. So legislation and regulation is about the floor, it's not about the ceiling. So we do need the incentives, we do need the carrots to push people in the direction of the ceiling, and a lot of the out-of-the-box thinking that occurs in the circular economy space really needs to be encouraged. So we need to move away from being a standard risk-averse culture to doing a lot more innovation and experimentation.
That's a great place for us to end. We're strict on time, so over to you, Carol.